So as we mentioned last week, is there anybody here this week that wasn't here last week that doesn't have the book? And is there anybody here that has your pre-assessment questions answered that you can hand in?
I'm scared.
You're scared? Hey, we ain't got to the quiz or the test you got to be scared about yet. This was a softball right here. You just wait till later, Lena. You were? She says she was teaching downstairs when you taught it. That's why she don't remember you teaching it. That's Q1 and Q2 of 2017. So as we mentioned last week, this is quite a different Bible class than what we are used to. Because we're not going through any particular Bible text or not even going through any particular topical study. This is more or less guided as a teacher training program. And I'll say it again, I'm not up here because I'm some kind of expert. The Waldrons are somewhat experts on the topic, and so that's the reason we're using their material again. But we do believe that it is vitally important that we have some amount of training for our Bible class teachers. That doesn't say or doesn't mean that you have to have some form of extra training to be a great Bible class teacher. I know there are many Bible class teachers that have probably never even seen this book. It's kind of like preachers. You don't have to go to some Bible college or get some degree to become a great preacher. You don't have to sit at the feet of Gamaliel to be a great disciple. So that's not what this is about. But at the same time, we recognize that being a Bible class teacher is very important. And so if there are things that we can discuss that will help us in that realm, how great of a thing is that? Because we're obviously trying to help lead souls to heaven. And so that's the reason that we're doing this class. And so the idea is we've got some older people in here that have taught for many more years than what I've taught, so hopefully you've got some input. We can all share things that maybe we've tried and done that worked out well, things that didn't do so well. And then also with going through this book, we can learn maybe some new things that will help us whenever we go on to teach future Bible classes. So just quickly, last week we talked a little bit about the catechetic response. What was that?
Questions that are already answered and you memorize the answers.
All right, so yeah, so it's just basically almost like memorization. So is that beneficial?
No.
In the long term, it's not really beneficial. Now, unless you're memorizing Bible verses, that can be very beneficial. But in the scheme of trying to understand the Bible and learn basic principles of how we should lead our lives, and trying to serve God, just because you can recite a particular answer to a question, maybe, what was the dimensions of Noah's Ark? Is that really going to help us go to heaven? Is it an interesting Bible fact? Maybe if you're an architect. But just because somebody can recite that and answer it on a question doesn't help them in the long term. And so we've got to make sure that we stay away from the catechetic response where we're just asking like one word questions or answers. And one of the things that we talked about just briefly is we have a tendency, because I think most of us recognize, okay, this is a problem, the catechetic response, where and a lot of times maybe it's you have a Bible verse and you have part of the words and then you just fill in the rest of the words. There's not a lot of thought that goes into it. We realize that in the long term that's not very good, and so what has happened is we've almost swung like a pendulum to the other side, and it's like, okay, we got to make sure that we make it relevant. Now, is that bad? Is that a bad thing? No, we should try to make it relevant and make application to ourselves. But the key thing that the Waldrons are trying to get us to understand is oftentimes in trying to make it relevant, we completely do away with the story. And he mentioned that oftentimes, like if you're preaching, and I will just say, I appreciate the example, but preaching is a totally different situation than Bible class teaching, because when Jesse's up here preaching, we got 2 or 3 year olds that can at least hear and understand words, and then we got 70, 80 year olds. You see a pause there? Yeah. And so we've got some that are really young and some that are not as young, and you've got the whole spectrum that you're trying to present something that at least everybody can get something out of. So we're not doing that in a Bible class setting. We have a particular age group that we're working with. And so when you're preaching, maybe with certain things, you might make the assumption that, okay, everybody knows the story of the flood, and so you're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the story of the flood, and you're more going to get into the application side of things. That's very dangerous for us to do, especially when we're teaching younger children, even middle school age children. And so it's important that we include the stories that we are told in the Bible. And I'll just make a point, because I want to be very clear. When I say story, I don't mean some fable, something that's made up. The Bible is a story. It's a story about Jesus. And so when we are trying to teach someone about faithfulness, then you need to include the whole story of Joseph or the whole story of Noah. And so the story is very important. And so let's not forget that, and let's not leave that out while trying to make things relevant. So you got to make sure that you make it relevant while not trying to dismiss the Bible as a whole. And then we talked about, go ahead, Norm.
Yeah, and just an emphasis on that point, the story is in the Bible for a particular reason. God had an intent to it, and so we have to make sure that in fact we cover what the intended intent of the story was before you go anywhere else with it. So, and that's the point of this relevant thing. It's just a way of getting around actually teaching the truth of the Bible,
Yeah.
but shifting the focus to something else that might be included in the story, but has absolutely it wasn't God's purpose for having the story in there.
Right. Brent, do you have your hand up?
The makeup of the knowledge of the class that you're teaching can deem the need for some of the catechetic response questions, especially downstairs. If you have a brand new person coming to a Bible class for the first time, they're going to need some of the basics. All the way up to the students who have been raised in a church and a Bible class that need, how is this relevant to me? How is this particular Bible story relevant to me? That may be some of the reason why the Walterns present the way they do.
Yeah. And some of the examples that they use with Noah and with Joseph, one of the points that they're trying to make is there are very valuable lessons that can be learned from the story. And so one of the ones he goes through quite a bit of detail is the story of Joseph. And he kind of goes through this whole summarization of Joseph's life and all the things that he went through and all the lessons that anybody that is reading that can pull from that. He mentions on page 6, he says, I must be sure my students see the relationship between the story I am telling and the principles by which they must live. And again, that's the connection that we need to be making, but not making those principles stated apart from the story. Because what's going to live in the minds of a child or in the minds of a young person more than telling them that you need to share? Well, if you tell them the story of Joseph and the things that he went through, those things, and if you make them vivid as you're telling them these stories and you're reading through these stories, that's going to stick with them. And then the principles, they're able to understand themselves by remembering these great stories. Norm?
Well, it's part of our makeup as human beings. Life lessons are the things we remember the best. And all of us can go through and we're just thinking about different points and different moral values that we learned, and there's a story attached to all of those. And it didn't really sink in until you were the one that was directly involved in it, or your grandfather was, or whatever. And that life lesson is what made it stick.
Yeah, and you read through the stories of some of these people, and they have some pretty valuable life lessons that we can learn. He also mentions there on page 6, he says, therefore the details of the story teach the very lessons we are trying to impress. The story properly told makes its point with very little need for preaching about it. So that's just kind of the thing that we need to understand as far as we can't swing so far to the other side that we're so worried about trying to make it relevant that we actually don't tell the story. On page 7, he has a comment that says, the story is always the best way to make principles live in the hearts of men. And that can be, of course, I'm emphasizing the young ones, but that can be for those of us that are older too. It can help these live in our hearts. And maybe the things that we remember as we're older are things that we learned from these stories that were taught to us from a very young age. So then the question is, how serious is this problem? Of course, we made the point at the very beginning of the class, how there had been a study done at a particular congregation, and there's only like 5 minutes worth of teaching that was taking place within a 30 or 45-minute Bible class. And so he talks about the passage, Hosea 4, verse 6, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because you have rejected knowledge, I will also reject you from being my priest. Since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children. So was the problem that they didn't have the information? What was the problem? It says, one, they rejected it. They rejected the knowledge. And then it sounds like whatever knowledge they had, they forgot it. So they had rejected and they had forgotten. So what's one way that we can keep from forgetting something? Repetition. That's right. I mean, many times I have talked about how I'll always remember when I was growing up, every time I walked out the door, my mom said, remember who you are. And if she'd have just said it once, you think I'd have remembered? Probably not, unless something really bad had happened like that particular night. But more than likely, you're not going to hear something just once and just remember, but it was over and over and over and over again. And so that's the point that he makes with toward the end of the lesson is once is not enough. And so he brings up this idea of overlearning. It's being exposed to a fact so many times that it becomes a permanent part of one's memory. And that's what we want for our children. Now, it's not going to happen when they're in the bucket class. But if we start teaching them when they're in the bucket class, and then we continue teaching them when they move up to the seats and then into the elementary class, into the middle school class, into the high school class, by the time they get to the high school class, they're going to have so much of this information that's going to be in their memory bank because of how well that we taught it. And so he mentions there that it takes 30 effective repetitions for a fact to become a permanent part of one's memory. But the key thing is on the effectiveness, not so much on the 30, but on the effectiveness. And so how can we make things more, or how can we be more effective in the way that we teach? What are some ways that we can be more effective?
Vary the ways in which you get the message to them. So it might be a demonstration one time about, what's hot and what's cold. You put your finger in there. Okay, now I understand what that is. Now stay away from the hot things. And just different ways of presenting the same thing over a period of time until it becomes a life experience for them.
Right. All of the senses, Clarissa.
Yeah, for the younger classes, it's really easy to do repetitions in different ways. Just for the past 6 months, I've done the preschool class, and so it's like you present it from the Bible, you present the story, and then we may act it out, and then I might find a good video that in a couple of minutes retells the story. So it's like I'm trying at least 3 or 4 ways in that time to tell the same story, and then I might only have 2 or 3 minutes for them to do something that they go home with.
All right, so just within one class period, you're actually repeating it and trying to tell it in different ways and having a different approach. And part of the benefit of that is obviously we all learn differently, and there may be something particular way that's going to stick with one kid, and a particular way, a different approach that may stick with another kid. One of the points that he makes too is, and this is the last paragraph on page 8, he says, for learning to be its most effective, there need to be intervals between the repetitions. These intervals need to not need to be not quite long enough for the facts to be forgotten, and then gradually lengthened as the facts become better entrenched. And so one of the things that we have to make sure is that we're continuing to go over the same things. And I think that it may have been this lesson that I've gotten to the point, this must be a sign of getting old, but like you read through all these lessons and sometimes some of the stories start kind of coming together. And I'd mentioned this last week. I think that whenever he would go for gospel meetings and he's talking, at the supper table with a family, and he's asking a kid about Samuel, and come to find out the kid's only been taught Samuel twice in his 14 years, and so you're not going to know a whole lot about Samuel if you only heard about him twice in 14 years. And so that's too long of an interval between first grade and I think fourth grade were the times that he had heard. So this is why when the kids are younger, we're really going over the life of Jesus, the life of Christ, more so. You're doing the stories of Noah and Joseph and some of these things, that there are a lot of things that they can get out of it, and it's being repeated over and over and over again. It's one of the reasons why we've just, not that long ago, completed a 3.5-year study through the whole Bible, and guess what we're fixing to start doing? We're going to do the same thing again. And that's a benefit to all of us. There's been now a certain interval of time, and so we're going to go back through it. So toward the end of the lesson, then he says, what's the answer? So the main point that has been made in this lesson is that a problem does exist in the teaching that is being done in most congregations across the country. We are raising young people who do not know their Bibles. So he says the rest of the book will be spent making suggestions about how to teach more effectively. So the point is, this is a problem. This is a problem in a lot of congregations throughout the country and throughout the world. And then he says, since we are all trying to go to heaven ourselves, and since we are trying hard to teach our children how to reach heaven, we could not spend our time on any more profitable subject than how to teach effectively. All right, so one of the discussion questions, or I guess he calls it an assignment, but what improvements could be made? So just after kind of reviewing the first lesson, what are some improvements that you think could be made? And this is maybe with classes that you've taught or classes that you've been a part of. And if you've got improvements that can be made for what we're doing absolutely right now, that's very important too. So I'll listen to that. Norm?
On the repetition side of it, this is where the family gets involved. You have things like, for instance, the read through the Bible in a year. Okay, if you do that, you've gone through all of it. Before the classes, the parents getting involved with the children in going over their lessons, having them, if the child has already done their lesson and gotten through it, asking some questions about that. And then they're going to class, and then they're getting it in class, and they're talking and getting different perspectives in class. So they got different perspectives there. They got them at home. They're doing their own home. These add up over the period of time. And all of those things are easy and available to us if we just take the time to do them.
All right, so making sure that we're doing our Bible lessons at home, that the kids are getting their lessons. And I think that part of that, one of the things that I have thought of before is good communication between the parent and the teacher. And so, especially with classes that are downstairs, that the teacher communicates with the parents about what's going on in regards to what is being taught, but also if there's particular problems. And maybe they're concerned about someone's not picking, a concept up as well as maybe one of the other students, and just having that open communication between teachers and parents. Did I see another hand over here? Ms. Shirley?
I think the more that you can get the class involved, but it's helpful.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that I wrote down. I remember a class that I taught, this has been several years ago, and after I went through this book and I'm reflecting on how I had done different Bible classes, there was one in particular I went back and I was like, you know what? Honestly, I'm walking away from that now. I feel like I was just doing more preaching than teaching. And I guess because it was almost more of a lecture type thing than anything else. And so, yeah, I do agree that getting the students involved and engaged will help tremendously. Brent, do you have your, go ahead.
Teachers knowing their students and knowing their ability and their levels can make a huge difference in the student's ability to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that part of that is the communication between the teacher and the parents. And so if you as a parent know that, one of your children or multiple of your children have a particular issue, let the teacher know about that. Make them aware of that. One of the things that I had written down is actually as a teacher interacting outside of Bible class with the students as well, and developing a little bit more of a rapport with them. And that makes them feel more comfortable in that setting whenever you're their Bible class teacher then. Anything else with lesson 1 before we move on to lesson 2? All right, so lesson 2, teachers cannot do it alone. So most of the failures in teaching children occur in the home, and we know that God places the primary responsibility on parents for training of their own young. And in the book he mentions, and I think I had mentioned this last week, how he mentions Deuteronomy 31, 9 through 13, that talks about every 7 years there's going to be a reading of the law. And okay, if that was the only opportunity that the kids ever had to hear the law was once every 7 years, it's not going to be very ingrained in them. They're actually not going to probably know very much of it at all. And so then the point that we mentioned from Deuteronomy 6, 4 through 9 is this was a daily thing that parents were supposed to be doing with their children. And so there's great responsibility that we have as parents. Obviously, fathers are given the primary responsibility to bring up our children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. We see that from Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. And so this is where the majority of the teaching should be happening and the majority of the learning should be happening. And I think that a good way to do that is even what Norm was talking about with the Bible class lessons. And at the bottom of page 10, he says, "We are depriving our children of their most precious God-given heritage if we are not diligently teaching the things of God. We are starving them to death spiritually. Even preschoolers can learn most Bible stories. Upper elementary children can and should learn all historical portions of the Bible. If the teenagers in the congregation where you attend cannot answer straightforward fact questions on any and every Bible story, then we have failed somewhere along the way as parents and teachers. There is no way around that conclusion." I think that sometimes we sell our children short. It's like, well, they're too young for that. They're too young to understand that. And we keep saying that, and then we keep saying that, and then eventually they're now in middle school, and we've not taught them half the things that we should have. And so those of you that have been in the bucket class, and obviously those of us that have had kids, which is most of us, from a very early age, kids pick things up. They're a lot smarter than what we give them credit for. He continues there and says that the child's life is in a balance with many, many influences to put on the scale. Some of them are good, but many of them are wicked. Which way will the scales tip? So, if we think about the fact that the child's life is in the balance, and we look at the different influences that they have, again, first and foremost should be their parents. And one thing that he doesn't include in here, but I would include here, siblings. I think that siblings obviously are a huge part of the growth process of any child if you have siblings. And so first and foremost, the parents need to be, I guess if the parents aren't the biggest influence, you got problems. You got big problems if the parents are not the biggest influence. So he talks about school, and obviously if your children are going to public school, that's going to be heavily influential in their lives because for so many hours throughout the day, they're going to be in an environment where they are surrounded by their teachers, and they're going to be surrounded by other students that are their same age. And so obviously there is going to be an influence there. There's no way around it. You can't say that my kid's not being influenced by the school because of whatever reason. The fact that they're in that environment for an extended period of time, they're going to be influenced by that, again, by the teachers, but they're going to be very influenced by the students that they have around them, those that they may call their friends. And so there's going to be an enormous amount of peer pressure that they feel. And I think that we're focusing on the young here, but obviously this is something that will influence all of us, how our peers may view particular things and how they handle particular things, and it's going to change the way that we handle those things or see those things. And so peer pressure is a huge influence on our children. One that I don't think that we talk about maybe often enough is the child's personality, and this is where communication between the parents and the teachers come in very much so. And he mentions in the book, he says, a child's personality affects his choices in life. Some children conform to rules and standards easily, including God's standards, while others are more rebellious by nature and need extra guidance. And those of you that have been here for an extended period of time, for several years, you've heard me say many times, so I was one and John was the other. So we were brought up with the exact same parents, and I feel quite certain they treated us both the same. My dad was a grizzly bear to the both of us, but John, in his personality, didn't like to be told what to do. John was very rebellious. I was the kind of person, when I saw John get in trouble, I did not want any part of that, and so I was scared to death. And so a kid's personality, and I think that maybe in today's day and time they talk nature versus nurture, maybe. Okay, well, all of us have a particular nature that is within us because of the personality that we have, and some of us need to be beat over the head a few more times than other people, and we have to recognize that, and we have to be able to work within that. And this is why I think that it is so important. When I showed the pictures last week, and I said, what do you see? And what we better see is souls. This is where it's very important that we recognize there may be a kid in our Bible class that their personality clashes with us, and they may aggravate us. And guess what? That kid's soul is just as important as everybody else's soul that's in that room. And so we have to make sure that we know how to handle that. And if you need help, then you need to talk to the parent. All right? Don't disregard a kid or treat a kid differently because maybe their personality is a little bit different. We have to be able to work within that. Now, again, we have to understand too, though, that, and the point that he's trying to make is their personality makes a big difference as far as the choices that they're ultimately going to make. So he talks about society. Obviously, that's a big one. And one of the things that he doesn't mention in the book that I will throw in there is social media. So our kids can be very heavily influenced by social media. We went to a speech competition on Monday night, and one of the kids was talking about social media. I don't know if it was one of the 5th or 6th graders, and how that it can influence the way that you feel when you see a particular thing on social media, and maybe it's a family going on this nice vacation and you start feeling jealous. And there were some other things that she mentioned, but we can be heavily influenced by that, both for good and sometimes for bad. But we have to recognize that when our kids' lives are in the balance, society plays a huge role in that. Next, he talks about church services. So how much time throughout the week are we here at church services, typically? All right, 4 hours. How many hours are in a week? 168. I couldn't do quick math. So there's 168 hours in a week. 4 of those we're here. So obviously there's going to be some influence that takes place just because of being together in our worship services, and it's very important. But we have to recognize it's not a huge amount of time. And then if you think about just being one teacher. So we've got 168 hours in a week, and with just one particular teacher, either on Wednesday night or on Sunday morning, how much time do you get with a kid?
35, 40 minutes at the most.
All right, so you get maybe 40 minutes. All right, so now we're just sitting here talking about all of these influences on a kid and how much time that they're with their family and they're at school and their personality. And so now you're looking at this and think, well, I only have 40 minutes with them once a week. It's not very much, so it's not really that big of a deal, right? Is that the attitude we should have? Okay, so yeah, the amount of time that we have might be compared to a feather in regards to the balance of scales, and so it's not much. But he makes the point, as a teacher, I must work as if I were the child's one and only chance to go to heaven. That's the way we've got to look at it. We can't look at it as if, kid, I've only got you for 40 minutes. Like, I'm not really going to be able to have I'm definitely not going to have a whole lot of luck with you. So, no, you got to look at it as if you're the one, and you better take every opportunity. You better utilize all that 40 minutes to make sure that you're utilizing it to the best of your ability for the sake of the soul of that child. Miss Shirley and then Lena.
That's why each teacher has to know their material and what they're going to go over before they get in class.
That's a huge deal, making sure that you're prepared, and we'll talk about that some more. Lena?
The emotional attachment, especially for little children, is important. A child can go to school and not pay attention and let it go through their ears, but then a child can come to one class and love that teacher or love that style, and then go away from that class wanting to come back and with a lot of knowledge. Timmy sits at home and does wise man build his house upon a rock. Well, we didn't teach him. He learned it somewhere, and this 40 minutes here definitely affect him. And that's just one little example. I'm sure everybody has those.
And that's a great example. That tells you how important it is and the effect that we can have on even those that are really, really young. And so don't ever make light of the 40 minutes. And I don't remember if it was in this lesson or it's in another lesson, but you got to be very careful, because you know what? In a 13-week quarter, maybe you have one of those weeks where you had a bad day at work. And you can't bring that to Bible class then, especially if you're teaching. You've got to set those things aside and make sure that you're giving everything that you've got to the kids. Was there another hand? Miss Shirley?
As young as Camry is, she can go over what she hears in class, because we sing when I've got her, and she knows the wise men.
Yeah, absolutely.
Actions, and then she knows the Pat the Bible song, and you know all that as young as she is.
Just shows you how early they can start picking things up. So he makes the comment, as a parent, my child is my responsibility. I ask him to come into existence. Now he will exist forever. We made that decision as parents. Now the kid's going to be in existence forever. But where? And we play such a huge part in that, and we need to remember that. And so he talks about making sure that we're screening the influences of our kids, and I think that is a big part of being a parent, where you're trying to increase the number of good influences that they have and try to avoid as many of the bad influences that you can as possible. And then he makes the point, he says, if my child lives to reach the age of accountability before God, then he will give an account for his own actions. But what if I did not teach him how to make proper decisions or which actions were pleasing to God? Then I will have to give an account before God for my failure when it is my turn to be judged. And that's a pretty sobering thought whenever you think about that. Then he talks about how home teaching must be effective. You're going to see this word in several of the lessons, platitudes. Anybody, what's a platitude?
Like a highfalutin phrase.
It sure does. So it is a remark or statement, especially one with a moral content, that has been used too often to be interesting or thoughtful. So this kind of goes back to the catechetic response, where we just keep repeating the same phrases over and over again, and to the point where they just totally lose their meaning. And so we have to make sure that we're not just filling our kids, both at home and also in our Bible classes, just full of platitudes. And yeah, this is one that is mentioned several times within the book. So home teaching must itself be effective. And one of the passages that they use there is Deuteronomy 4, verse 9, which we've talked about. Only give heed to yourself and keep your soul diligently, so that you do not forget the things which your eyes have seen, and they do not depart from your heart all the days of your life, but make them known to your sons and your grandsons. And so the importance of this parental instruction cannot be overstated. And this isn't the primary focus of this particular class, but it is very important for us as a whole, as Christians, to recognize the importance of making sure that we are doing our jobs at home. So, why was the following generation one that knew not God? This is the generation after Joshua. Okay. So, do you think it was that they weren't actually even telling the stories, or they weren't taught properly?
All the above.
All the above. Turn over to page 14. I think this does a very good job of helping us to understand that we can tell the stories, but if we're not doing it effectively, it has no meaning. So on page 14, and just for the sake of time, I'm going to read, and I'm going to start. So this is a story of a father and a son. And if you remember, whenever the Israelites crossed over into Canaan, they were told to make an altar. And the purpose of that was so when your children see this and they ask, "What is this?" then they can explain to them that that's a tool that they can use to help tell them this story. And so he mentions there that the real explanation is not that the Israelites did no teaching. The truth more likely is that they did not teach effectively. And so then he gives this illustration. This is going to be a rather long reading. But he says, "Born during the wandering in the wilderness, our young man has known Moses as the great leader of Israel for all his years. He has seen many of the miracles in the wilderness. Finally, he stands in an audience and hears the aged Moses preach. Then Moses leaves the group, climbing his way up Mount Nebo, there to die and to be buried by the hand of God. Joshua becomes the new leader. He will do a good job. The command is passed throughout the camp. Prepare victuals, for on the third day we shall depart to cross the Jordan. Looking across the plain of the Jordan Valley, our friend could see the swollen river racing along to enter the Dead Sea just to the south. The spies, recently returned from Jericho, report that only with the greatest difficulty were they able to cross the rapid current of the river, because it was flood season. Word passes through the camp that Jehovah is about to do a great work. The whole camp of Israel moves out, following the priests who are carrying the holy ark upon their shoulders. The noise of this great company are all about as they make their way down the long valley from Abel Shittim to the banks of the river. Excitement fills the air. Sure enough, as the priests come to the edge of the racing Jordan, God stops the flow of the river. The water stopped coming from upstream, and soon the dry riverbed is exposed to view. The crowd starts across. The entire throng of men, women, children, wagons, and their flocks and herds cross. Then Joshua commands that one man from each tribe pick up a rock and bring it to their camping site, which they call Gilgal. A pillar is erected by stacking the stones. Joshua tells them, "In years to come, your sons will see these rocks and will ask, 'Father, what are these rocks for?' You shall say, 'My son, these rocks are for a sign to remind us of God's mighty deed, which he did for us in the stopping the Jordan River and bringing us into this land across its dry bed.'" The events of that day made a deep and lasting impression on the young man of our story, lending strength to his already firm determination to be faithful to the Lord. 15 years pass. Our young man is now in his prime. By now, let us suppose he has a son 10 years old. Let us suppose these people are from the tribe of Ephraim. On a particular day, the father and child have traveled from the hill country down toward the Jordan, planning to cross over to visit friends on the eastern side of the river. It's noon of the second day of their travel. As we listen on their conversation, they are leaving the city of palm trees where Jericho stood not many years before, and are heading toward the fords of the Jordan. The afternoon is passing fast when they come to the pillar of rocks at Gilgal. When the father sees the rocks, a flood of memories wash over his heart. Every sensation he felt on that day 15 years earlier floods his mind. Those memories in turn trigger other memories of those long years in the wilderness of miracles which God did before Israel. Oh, the glory of those memories. The child has not been this way before. He's curious and he asks his father, "Why are these stones here?" The question rouses the father from his memories. He looks around and notices that the afternoon is passing fast. The sun sets early here in the deep cleft of the Jordan Valley, and he wants to be ascending the eastern slopes by the time it goes down. So the father answers the child. Those rocks are there to remind us of the time God caused the Jordan to stop flowing, and we all crossed over on dry ground. Now let us hurry on, because we do not want to get caught here by the darkness. So had the father done his job? No. You can read about, of course, this is a story that they're making up. This isn't a biblical story. Obviously, it's based on some biblical facts of what God expected of the people. But he sees it, and you have this flood of emotions because he lived it. He was there when they crossed the Jordan. He got to see the dry ground. He was in the wilderness when God is providing for them. And so he is just flooded with these emotions. And God's expectation is, you're going to share that with your children so that their faith grows in me. And instead, did he tell him what the purpose of those rocks were? He sure did. But boy, did he miss it. Big time. And so we have to be very careful that when we are teaching our Bible classes, that we are impressing upon our kids the things that they need to be impressed on, and not just simply going through platitudes and trying to get them to memorize certain things. All right, so after these first two lessons, just how do you feel? Okay. Norm, let's go. I'll be honest. I'll be completely honest with you. I'll tell you how I felt the very first time I did this, and even how I feel now. Wow, I feel inadequate. I feel completely inadequate as a parent. I feel completely inadequate as a Bible class teacher. That's the way that I feel. And it can be daunting whenever you recognize the responsibility that you have as parents, one, in raising our children, bringing them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, and the great responsibility that we have whenever we are teaching a Bible class. And so I have to ask myself, okay, do we just run away and give up? Or do we view it as this huge elephant now that's in front of us that we just got to start eating? And how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So that doesn't mean that you give up. Jesse done shoot me down. So the point that he makes in the book too is, if it's because of your own inadequacy and you feel like you don't know these stories very well, does that mean you just give up? No. He actually says, you know what? Start burning the midnight oil. And you start putting the time in, and you start learning the stories, and you start preparing yourself now. So while it can be something that is very daunting, it can be something that is exciting too. And so maybe by the end of the class, we'll all have the Norm attitude. Let's go. Ready to go. All right, next week, we will obviously get into Lesson 3, and we'll try to get into, we're going to go ahead and skip Lesson 4, and so you can read Lesson 5. Lesson 3 is extremely important. So make sure that you do read through Lesson 3, and we'll focus the majority of our time on that next week. Thanks, everybody.